My name is Sarah Thompson. I am 38 years old, and I command a destroyer in the United States Navy. But to the people standing behind those pristine white columns of the Riverside Country Club, to the family whose blood runs through my veins, I might as well be a ghost. They've spent the last 15 years pretending I don't exist. And tonight, at my cousin Marcus's wedding reception, that pretense has never felt more suffocating. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I stand at the edge of the sprawling lawn, watching champagne glasses catch the golden hour light, listening to the gentle murmur of conversations I'm not invited to join. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly beyond the cliffs, its waves crashing against the rocks below, with a rhythm I know better than my own heartbeat. But here, among the people who share my last name, I feel more isolated than I ever have in the middle of the vast blue. The Thompson family built their fortune 3 generations ago in real estate development across Southern California. My grandfather, William Thompson, turned a small construction company into an empire that shaped the skyline of Los Angeles. My father, Robert Thompson, expanded into commercial properties and luxury resorts. My mother, Catherine, came from old money herself, the Riverside banking family, and their union created what society magazines called a power dynasty. My older brother, Michael, followed the blueprint perfectly. Harvard Business School, then straight into Thompson Development as vice president of acquisitions. At 32, he already owns a mansion in Beverly Hills and a vacation home in Aspen. My younger sister, Amanda, chose law, graduating summa cum laude from Stanford before joining the city's most prestigious firm specializing in corporate mergers. She married another lawyer, someone from a family the Thompsons had done business with for decades. Then there's me. The anomaly. The mistake. I remember the exact moment I shattered their carefully constructed world. I was 19, sitting in the marble-floored study of our family's estate in Pacific Palisades. The walls were lined with first-edition books that no one ever read, and awards that gleamed under crystal lighting. My father sat behind his mahogany desk, the same one his father had used, reviewing what he called my life trajectory presentation. He had prepared charts, enrollment paperwork for business school, even preliminary discussions with professors who might serve as mentors. Michael sat to his right, already nodding approvingly at the 5-year plan that would slot me neatly into the family business. Amanda lounged in the leather chair beside me, scrolling through her phone but listening intently. My mother stood by the window, her silk dress catching the afternoon light as she gazed out at the infinity pool and tennis court beyond. She turned when my father finished his presentation, her smile serene and confident. "So, darling," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she assumed agreement. "Michael will mentor you through your first 2 years in the acquisitions department, and by the time you're 25, you'll be ready for your own division." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, could smell my mother's expensive perfume, mixing with the leather and wood polish that always permeated this room. Michael leaned forward slightly, his expression expectant. Amanda finally looked up from her phone. "I've accepted my appointment to the Naval Academy," I said quietly. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread and expand until they touched every corner of our perfect family portrait. My father's pen stopped moving across the documents. Michael's confident smile faltered and died. Amanda's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor. My mother turned fully from the window, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching horror. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "The Naval Academy. Annapolis. I've been accepted, and I've committed to serve." My father set down his pen with the deliberate precision of a man trying to maintain control. "Sarah, this isn't funny." "It's not a joke, Dad." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't anticipation or consideration. This was the sound of a family fracturing in real time. My mother moved away from the window, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she crossed to where I sat. You cannot be serious. Do you understand what you're throwing away? What has this family built? What have we prepared for you? I understand perfectly. I just don't want it. Michael found his voice first. You don't want it? Sarah, do you have any idea how many people would kill for the opportunities we're offering you? How many young women would give anything to step into a position like this? Then they can have it. Amanda retrieved her phone from the floor, her movements careful and measured. When she spoke, her voice carried the same prosecutorial tone she would later perfect in courtrooms. This is about attention, isn't it? You couldn't handle that Michael and I excel at everything we touch, so you're choosing something completely different just to stand out. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that she genuinely believed what she was saying. To Amanda, my choice couldn't possibly be about principle or calling or genuine desire to serve. It had to be a reaction to them, a desperate bid for attention in a family where achievement was measured in dollars and social status. No, Amanda, this is about me wanting to be something other than an extension of what you all have already decided I should be. My father stood up, his chair rolling backward on its casters. He was a tall man, imposing in the way that successful people often are, but in that moment he looked smaller somehow, as if my words had physically deflated him. The military is not for people like us, Sarah. It's for people who don't have options, who need structure because they can't create success for themselves. You're a Thompson. You don't need the military. The military needs people like you, yes, but you don't need it. The condescension in his voice cut deeper than anger would have. He wasn't furious. He was disappointed in a way that suggested he thought I was making an objectively wrong choice, like insisting that 2 + 2 = 5. Maybe that's exactly why I need to do this, I said, standing to meet his gaze. Because I am a Thompson, and maybe it's time a Thompson served something bigger than their own bank account. My mother's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut glass. How dare you suggest that this family doesn't serve? Your father employs thousands of people. I sit on the boards of 6 different charities. We contribute more to this community than most people make in a lifetime. Writing checks isn't the same thing as service, Mom. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. I watched my mother's face transform, saw the moment when disappointment crystallized into something colder and more permanent. She looked at me as if I had become a stranger, someone wearing her daughter's face but speaking in a foreign language. I see, she said softly. You've made your choice then. I have. Then you'll live with the consequences. I left that night, not dramatically, not with slammed doors or tearful goodbyes, but quietly, like smoke dissipating in a breeze. I packed 2 suitcases with clothes and a few personal items, took the money I had saved from summers, working at a local marina, and drove my beat-up Honda Civic away from the only home I had ever known. No one stopped me. No one asked me to reconsider. By the time I pulled out of the circular driveway, every light in the house was off except for the study, where I could see my father's silhouette still sitting behind his desk, probably already figuring out how to explain my absence to business associates and family friends. The Naval Academy was everything my family wasn't. Where the Thompson estate was all marble and crystal and soft lighting designed to impress, Annapolis was brick and steel and fluorescent bulbs that showed everything exactly as it was. Where my family valued appearance and networking and the art of the deal, the Academy demanded precision, honor, and the kind of leadership that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. I threw myself into it with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prove something, though I wasn't entirely sure what. I studied navigation and engineering and military history. I learned to sail in weather that would terrify most recreational boaters. I mastered the protocols and procedures that would one day help me command a ship and the 300 souls aboard it. During my first semester, I received exactly 2 communications from home. One was a formal letter from my father's attorney, informing me that my trust fund had been frozen indefinitely. The other was a brief note from Amanda, letting me know that they had told everyone I was formal letter for Mouse and Suatef, and asking me not to contradict that story if anyone asked. I didn't respond to either. The years passed in a blur of training exercises, academic challenges, and the gradual transformation from the privileged girl who had walked away from Pacific Palisades into something harder and more focused. I made friends among my fellow midshipmen, People who understood that service meant sacrifice, that leadership was earned through competence rather than inherited through DNA. I also learned loneliness in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not the loneliness of being alone, which I had expected, but the loneliness of having experiences and achievements that the people who had shaped you could never understand or appreciate. When I graduated and received my commission as an ensign, I stood in the crowd of families and felt the absence of mine like a physical weight. My first deployment took me to the Persian Gulf, where I learned that the ocean could be both beautiful and terrifying, sometimes within the same hour. I served on a guided missile cruiser, working my way up through various positions, learning how to manage complex systems and even more complex people. The work was demanding, sometimes dangerous, always meaningful in ways that the family business had never been. I wrote letters home occasionally, formal updates that I sent to the Pacific Palisades address without knowing if anyone read them. I included photos of my ship, descriptions of ports I had visited, mentions of commendations I had received. The letters were never returned, but they were never answered either. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Years accumulated like barnacles on a ship's hull. I was promoted to lieutenant, then lieutenant commander, then commander. I specialized in naval warfare tactics, and eventually found myself in charge of training programs for new officers. My superiors praised my ability to make complex decisions under pressure, my talent for managing diverse teams, and my instinct for leadership in crisis situations. None of it mattered to the people who had taught me to tie my shoes and ride a bicycle. Tia. The weddings were the worst part. Michael married someone from another development family in a ceremony that made the society pages of 3 different magazines. I learned about it from a newspaper I picked up at a coffee shop in Norfolk, where I was stationed at the time. The article described the, quote, intimate gathering of 200 guests, and mentioned that the bride and groom had honeymooned in the French Riviera. Amanda's wedding was smaller but no less elaborate, held at the Riverside Country Club, with what the announcements described as, quote, classic elegance. I found out about it through a social media post that someone from high school had shared, not because anyone had thought to inform me directly. I wasn't invited to either celebration. More accurately, I wasn't considered for the invitation. I had been erased so completely from the family narrative that my absence wasn't even noted. The wedding party photos showed my siblings flanked by cousins and family friends, the spaces where I might have stood filled seamlessly by people who belonged to the world I had abandoned. The promotions continued. I took command of my first ship, a destroyer, at 35. The ceremony was held at Naval Base San Diego, with the traditional reading of orders and transfer of responsibility. My crew, 280 sailors who would trust me with their lives and their careers, stood at attention as I officially became their captain. I stood on the bridge of my ship for the first time as its commanding officer, looking out at the harbor where sleek naval vessels shared space with civilian yachts and commercial vessels. The Pacific stretched beyond the bay, endless and powerful and indifferent to human ambition. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving home. I felt like I belonged somewhere. But even belonging couldn't fill the hollow space where family approval should have been. I had built a life of purpose and responsibility, had earned the respect of my peers and the trust of my subordinates, had served my country in ways that most people never would. Yet, when I allowed myself to think about the sprawling estate in Pacific Palisades, about the family dinners and holiday celebrations that continued without me, the old wound still bled. 3 months ago, I received a wedding invitation. Heavy cream cardstock, elegant calligraphy, the kind of expensive stationery that my mother had always favored. Marcus Thompson, my cousin on my father's side, was marrying someone named Jennifer Walsh. The ceremony would be held at St. Margaret's Episcopal Church, followed by a reception at the Riverside Country Club. My name was on the envelope. Not just Sarah Thompson, but Captain Sarah Thompson, USN. Someone had done their research, had discovered not just that I existed but what I had become. The invitation was addressed to my ship, forwarded through official channels, which meant that whoever sent it had gone through considerable effort to find me. I stared at that invitation for 3 weeks before responding. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to continue the silence that had defined my relationship with the Thompson family for 15 years. But another part of me, the part that had never quite stopped being 19 years old and desperate for approval. Wanted to see them again. Wanted to know if time had changed their perspective, if my achievements in a world they didn't understand might have earned me some measure of respect. I sent back the RSVP card with a simple checkmark next to "Will attend." I didn't include a note or explanation. I simply confirmed my presence and mailed it back to the Pacific Palisades address that I still knew by heart. Now I'm here, standing at the edge of Marcus's wedding reception, wearing my dress blues because I no longer own civilian clothes appropriate for occasions like this. The uniform draws curious glances from other guests, most of whom probably assume I'm someone's friend from outside the family's usual social circle. They're not wrong. I can see my parents across the garden, my father distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, my mother elegant in champagne silk. They're holding court near the head table, accepting congratulations and compliments on the beautiful ceremony, the perfect weather, the exquisite venue. Michael stands nearby with his wife, their 2 young children playing quietly at their feet. Amanda mingles with the other lawyers and judges, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze. None of them have acknowledged my presence. I've been here for an hour, have walked past my mother twice, have made eye contact with Michael across the dance floor. They see me, I know they do, but they look through me as if I'm a mirage, as if acknowledging my existence might somehow make their carefully constructed reality crumble. The sun is setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and coral that remind me of sunrises I've watched from the bridge of my ship. The wedding photographer moves through the crowd, capturing moments of joy and celebration that will be preserved in albums and frames for decades to come. I wonder if any of those photos will include me, or if I'll be cropped out the way I've been edited from the family story. A server approaches with a tray of champagne. I take a glass but don't drink from it, just hold it as a prop, while I continue to observe the celebration I'm attending but not truly part of. The bubbles rise in perfect columns, catching the light like tiny stars, and I find myself thinking about the physics of effervescence, about pressure and release and the way things change when their environment shifts. Tomorrow I'll return to my ship, to the world where my decisions matter, and my leadership makes a difference. But tonight, I'm Sarah Thompson again, the daughter who chose duty over dynasty, the sister who valued service over status. Tonight, I'm standing in the shadows of the life I didn't choose, wondering if the people I've spent 15 years missing ever really knew me at all. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and ocean salt as the reception reached its peak. The string quartet had transitioned to more upbeat selections, and couples began moving toward the designated dance floor area carved out on the manicured lawn. Chinese lanterns swayed gently overhead, casting warm pools of light across the gathering, while the last remnants of sunset faded into deep purple twilight. I had positioned myself near the ancient oak tree that dominated the eastern corner of the garden, its massive trunk providing both shelter and a strategic vantage point. From here, I could observe without being easily observed, could watch the intricate social choreography of my family's world without becoming an unwilling participant. The bride, Jennifer, seemed genuinely happy. She moved through the crowd with natural grace, her laugh infectious as she greeted guests and posed for endless photographs. Marcus, my cousin, beamed beside her with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone still processing that he had successfully orchestrated such an elaborate celebration. They made a good pair, both lawyers who had met during their first year at a prestigious downtown firm, both from families that understood the language of success and expectation. As I watched them, I found myself remembering Marcus as a child. We had been close once, during those summer visits when the extended Thompson family would gather at my grandparents' estate in Montecito. He was 3 years younger than me, with an infectious curiosity about everything from tide pools to telescope observations. We had built elaborate sandcastles together, had searched for hermit crabs in the rocky coves below the cliffs, had spent hours lying on our backs in the grass, making up stories about the shapes we saw in the clouds. That boy seemed very far away from the polished attorney, now accepting congratulations and business cards from potential clients. The transformation wasn't surprising. It was exactly what the Thompson family excelled at, molding promising raw material into successful, socially acceptable adults. I wondered if he ever thought about those summer adventures, or if they had been filled with other childhood memories deemed irrelevant to adult achievement. A burst of laughter drew my attention back to the immediate scene. My father was telling one of his favorite stories to a small group of business associates. Something about a difficult negotiation that had resulted in the acquisition of prime beachfront property. His audience listened with the kind of attentive interest that successful people command, nodding at appropriate moments and chuckling at the practiced punchlines. My mother stood nearby, elegant and composed, adding strategic comments and gentle corrections that demonstrated her own intimate knowledge of the family business. She had always been more than just a trophy wife. Her own background in banking had made her a genuine partner in my father's enterprises. Together, they projected the kind of unified competence that had built their empire and maintained their social standing for 3 decades. Michael caught my eye across the garden, and for a moment our gazes held. His expression was unreadable, a carefully neutral mask that gave nothing away. He said something to his wife, who glanced in my direction with polite curiosity, but no recognition, then began moving through the crowd toward me. My breath caught slightly. In 15 years, we had not spoken directly. Our only communication had been the indirect messages conveyed through lawyers, and the occasional formal notification about family business matters that might legally concern me. As he approached, I could see how the years had changed him. His hair showed the first touches of silver at the temples, and his face carried the kind of confident maturity that came from never having to doubt his place in the world. "Sarah," he said when he reached me, his voice carrying the same measured tone I remembered from board meetings and family discussions. "I wasn't sure you would actually come. I wasn't sure either." We stood in awkward silence for a moment, two people who had once shared a childhood but now felt like strangers meeting at a cocktail party. The sounds of the reception continued around us. Conversations, laughter, the soft clink of silverware against china as the catering staff prepared for dinner service. "You look well," he said finally. "The uniform suits you." I almost smiled at that. "Thank you. Congratulations on your own successes." I heard about the Portland project. His eyebrows rose slightly, surprised that I had kept track of Thompson Development's activities. "Thank you. It's been challenging but rewarding." The conversation felt stilted, overly formal, like two diplomats from allied nations discussing trade agreements. We were speaking in the language of polite strangers, carefully avoiding any topic that might lead to emotional terrain. I wondered if this was how it would always be between us now, if too much time and too many unspoken grievances had permanently altered our ability to connect as siblings. "Mom and Dad know you're here," he said, glancing back toward where our parents continued their social obligations. I assumed they did. They're not sure how to handle it. Handle it? The phrase struck me as oddly clinical. "I'm not in a situation to be managed, Michael. I'm your sister." Something flickered across his face. A brief crack in the diplomatic facade. "Are you? Because for the last 15 years, you've been a ghost. No contact, no visits, no acknowledgement of anything happening in our lives. Amanda's children don't even know they have an aunt. How are we supposed to treat you like family when you've actively chosen not to be part of this family?" The words stung, partly because there was truth in them. I had chosen distance, had preferred the clean break to the messy work of maintaining relationships with people who fundamentally disagreed with my life choices. But his characterization felt incomplete, one-sided. "I wrote letters," I said quietly. "For the first few years, I sent updates, photos, explanations of what I was doing and why it mattered to me. They were never answered. You were pursuing something none of us understood. What were we supposed to say? Congratulations on choosing a life that rejected everything we valued?" Before I could respond, a disturbance near the entrance to the garden drew our attention. Several guests had turned toward the curved driveway, their conversations pausing as they craned their necks to see what had captured their interest. A low, rumbling sound, distant but growing stronger, cut through the evening air. "Is that?" Michael frowned, his head tilted as he tried to identify the source of the noise. I knew that sound. I had heard it countless times during training exercises, during emergency evacuations, during ceremonial events that required precision timing and flawless execution. It was the deep, rhythmic pulse of military helicopter rotors, still far enough away to be more felt than heard, but approaching fast. "Helicopter?" I said, my voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of my pulse. Military, by the sound of it. The rumbling grew louder, and now other guests were beginning to notice. Conversations faltered as heads turned skyward, searching for the source of the intrusion into their carefully orchestrated evening. The string quartet played on, oblivious to the growing distraction, but their music began to sound thin and inadequate against the strengthening mechanical thunder approaching from the northwest. Michael looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sarah, what?" "I don't know," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I felt a cold certainty settling in my stomach. In my career, emergency summons arrived in specific ways, following protocols that had been established through decades of military tradition. And those protocols didn't make exceptions for family weddings or personal time. The sound was unmistakable now, close enough that even the most sheltered civilian could identify it. Several guests moved toward the outer edges of the garden, seeking better vantage points to spot the approaching aircraft. The bride and groom paused in their receiving line, Jennifer's face showing confusion while Marcus attempted to maintain his composure, despite the obvious disruption to his carefully planned celebration. My father appeared at my mother's side, his expression sharp with the kind of focused attention he brought to unexpected business complications. They were both looking in my direction now, and I could see the moment when understanding began to dawn on their faces. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a training exercise that happened to coincide with a family gathering. The helicopter crested the line of eucalyptus trees that bordered the northern edge of the country club property, and I felt my breath catch. It was a Navy SH-60 Seahawk, painted in the standard gray that marked it as official military business. The aircraft banked slightly as it approached the open lawn area beyond the reception space, its searchlight sweeping across the ground in a methodical pattern. Around me, the wedding guests had fallen into stunned silence. The string quartet finally noticed that no one was listening to them and allowed their instruments to fall quiet. Even the catering staff had stopped their preparations to watch as the helicopter settled into a stable hover above the golf course fairway, its rotor wash sending napkins and flower petals swirling through the evening air. The aircraft's side door slid open with military precision, and a figure in dress whites appeared in the opening. Even from a distance, even in the mixed light of Chinese lanterns and helicopter search beams, I could see the gold stripes on his sleeves that marked him as a senior officer. He stepped down onto the fairway with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, then began walking directly toward the reception area. "Captain Thompson," Michael said quietly, and I realized that for the first time in 15 years he had addressed me by my military rank rather than just my name. I straightened unconsciously, my posture shifting into the automatic bearing that years of military training had ingrained. Around us, 200 wedding guests stood frozen in a tableau of disbelief, their champagne glasses forgotten in their hands as they watched a uniformed Navy officer stride across the perfectly manicured lawn toward our small family gathering. The officer's destination was unmistakable. He moved with the kind of purposeful directness that left no doubt about his mission, his gaze fixed steadily on the cluster of people near the ancient oak tree. Fixed steadily on me. As he drew closer, I could make out more details. Captain's bars on his collar, ribbons on his chest that indicated significant operational experience, the kind of bearing that suggested he was delivering a message of the highest importance. This wasn't a courtesy call or a bureaucratic formality. This was official business, urgent enough to interrupt a family celebration, and dramatic enough to require a helicopter delivery. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my breathing remained controlled. Whatever crisis had prompted this summons, whatever emergency required my immediate attention, I would handle it with the professionalism that my career had demanded. But first, I would have to face the moment when my two worlds, the family that had rejected me and the military that had embraced me, collided in full view of everyone who had ever doubted my choices. The officer was close enough now that I could see his face clearly, could read the gravity in his expression. He stopped 10 feet away, came to attention with parade ground precision, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly silent garden. "Captain Sarah Thompson, United States Navy." It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation, delivered with the kind of authority that brooked no argument and demanded immediate response. Around me, I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes, could sense the shift in the evening's energy as my carefully hidden identity was laid bare for everyone to see. "Yes, sir," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "Admiral Rodriguez sends his compliments and requires your immediate presence aboard the USS Leahy. Emergency protocols are in effect." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired cannon, irreversible and transformative. In the space of 30 seconds, everything had changed. The wedding reception, the family reunion, the careful pretense that I was just another guest, all of it had been swept away by the simple reality of who I was and what I represented. I was Captain Sarah Thompson, United States Navy, and the Navy was calling me home. Mop, Wanabes. The flight to Naval Base San Diego passed in controlled silence. Captain Rodriguez, the officer who had delivered my summons, sat across from me in the helicopter's cabin, his expression focused on the classified tablet in his hands. The steady thrum of rotor blades provided a mechanical rhythm that helped calm my racing thoughts as we lifted away from the country club, leaving behind a crowd of stunned wedding guests and the family who had finally seen me for who I had become. Below us, the California coastline stretched in an endless ribbon of lights, suburban neighborhoods giving way to industrial complexes and then to the darker expanse of military installations. I had made this journey countless times over the years, but tonight felt different. Tonight, I wasn't returning from leave or reporting for routine duty. Tonight, something significant enough to interrupt a family wedding was waiting for me aboard the USS Leahy. My mind drifted back to the moment 15 years earlier when I had first set foot on a Navy vessel as a midshipman. The USS Constellation had been conducting training exercises off the coast of Virginia, and I remember standing on the flight deck, overwhelmed by the complexity of operations happening simultaneously around me. Aircraft launched and recovered with split-second precision, while deck crews moved in choreographed patterns that looked chaotic to untrained eyes but revealed perfect organization to anyone who understood the underlying systems. That first deployment had taught me what leadership actually meant. Not the boardroom negotiations and profit margin discussions that dominated my family's world, but the moment-to-moment decisions that kept people alive and missions successful. I learned to navigate not just by instruments and charts, but by reading weather patterns and ocean currents, by understanding how wind and tide could transform a routine operation into a life-threatening emergency. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes had been my first division officer, a 20-year veteran who had worked her way up from enlisted ranks through sheer competence and determination. She was the one who taught me that respect in the military wasn't inherited or purchased. It was earned through demonstrated ability and proven judgment under pressure. "Thompson," she had said during my first week aboard, "I don't care what your daddy does for a living or where you went to prep school. Out here, you're measured by how well you do your job and how much your shipmates trust you to do theirs when the situation gets critical." She had been right, of course. The Navy had its own aristocracy, but it was based on performance rather than pedigree. The sailors who served under me didn't care about my family's real estate empire or my mother's charity board positions. They cared whether I could make sound tactical decisions during storm conditions, whether I understood the technical systems well enough to troubleshoot problems in real time, whether I would put their safety ahead of my own career advancement. I had proven myself gradually, one crisis at a time. During my second deployment, we had responded to a distress call from a merchant vessel taking on water during a typhoon in the South China Sea. While other officers coordinated rescue operations from the bridge, I had volunteered to lead the boarding party that would attempt to stabilize the damaged ship's pumping systems. For 6 hours, we worked in conditions that turned routine procedures into tests of endurance and skill, ultimately saving the vessel and its crew of 23. The commendation from that operation had been my first official recognition, but more importantly, it had been the moment when I realized I had found my calling. Not because of the medal or the ceremony, but because of the feeling of absolute clarity that came from knowing my actions had directly prevented tragedy. That sense of purpose had sustained me through years of deployments, through the gradual accumulation of rank and responsibility, through the long stretches of separation from everything familiar. My promotion to lieutenant commander had come during my assignment to Naval Special Warfare Command, where I had specialized in maritime interdiction operations. We worked with Coast Guard units and international partners to disrupt drug trafficking networks operating throughout the Caribbean. The work was dangerous and often thankless, involving long periods of surveillance followed by brief, intense confrontations with vessels attempting to avoid detection. It was during this assignment that I had first encountered Admiral Rodriguez, though he had been Captain Rodriguez then, commanding a destroyer squadron that provided support for our operations. He was known throughout the fleet as a tactical innovator, someone who understood how traditional naval doctrine needed to evolve to address modern threats. More importantly, he was known as an officer who valued competence over connections, who promoted based on performance rather than political considerations. Our paths had crossed during Operation Neptune's Net, a complex multi-agency effort to intercept a sophisticated smuggling operation that had been evading law enforcement for months. The criminal organization was using high-speed boats and sophisticated communications equipment to coordinate their activities across international waters, staying one step ahead of conventional interdiction efforts. Rodriguez had been tasked with providing naval support for the operation, while my team was responsible for the actual boarding and seizure activities. The operation required unprecedented coordination between multiple services and agencies, with timing measured in seconds rather than minutes. Any miscommunication or procedural error could result in the loss of both the suspects and valuable intelligence about their broader network. The breakthrough had come when my analysis of their communication patterns revealed a vulnerability in their operational security. By coordinating our surveillance assets with Rodriguez's destroyers, we were able to triangulate their command vessel's position and intercept their entire fleet simultaneously. The operation resulted in the largest drug seizure in Caribbean waters that year, and the disruption of a network that had been operating with impunity for over a decade. Rodriguez had specifically requested my transfer to his command following that operation, recognizing qualities in my leadership style that complemented his own tactical approach. Under his mentorship, I had developed from a competent mid-level officer into someone capable of commanding complex operations involving multiple platforms and diverse personnel. The transition to command of my own vessel had been both exhilarating and terrifying. The USS Thunderbolt was a guided missile destroyer, one of the most sophisticated warships in the world, equipped with systems that could engage targets hundreds of miles away with precision that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. But technology was only as effective as the people who operated it, and my crew of 280 sailors represented every background, education level, and regional culture that America could produce. Building a cohesive team from such diversity required leadership skills that no business school or family legacy could provide. It meant understanding how a 19-year-old from rural Montana might respond differently to stress than a 30-year-old from urban Detroit. It meant knowing when to enforce discipline and when to show flexibility, when to demand immediate compliance, and when to allow time for questions and discussion. My first major test as a commanding officer had come during a humanitarian crisis in the Philippines, when a Category 5 typhoon had devastated coastal communities and overwhelmed local emergency response capabilities. The Thunderbolt had been dispatched as part of an international relief effort, but we arrived to find conditions far worse than initial reports had indicated. The storm had destroyed most of the port infrastructure, making it impossible for large relief vessels to deliver supplies directly to the affected areas. Roads had been washed out, bridges collapsed, and communication networks disrupted. Thousands of people were stranded in remote villages, with no access to food, clean water, or medical care. I had made the decision to use our ship's helicopters and small boats to establish a supply chain that bypassed the damaged infrastructure entirely. My crew had worked around the clock for 2 weeks, flying dangerous missions through unstable weather to deliver supplies and evacuate injured civilians. The operation had required constant improvisation and calculated risk-taking, with decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for people we would never meet again. When we finally departed Philippine waters, local officials credited our efforts with saving over 3,000 lives. The commendation from that deployment had been signed by the Secretary of the Navy himself, but the real reward had been the knowledge that my crew had performed beyond all expectations when faced with circumstances that tested every aspect of their training and character. Now, as the helicopter began its descent toward Naval Base San Diego, I could see the familiar silhouettes of destroyers and cruisers moored at the waterfront. Somewhere among those vessels was the USS Leahy, and whatever crisis had prompted my emergency summons, Admiral Rodriguez wouldn't have interrupted a family wedding unless the situation demanded immediate action from someone with my specific experience and capabilities. The landing was smooth and efficient, executed with the kind of precision that marked all military operations. As the helicopter touched down on the designated helipad, I could see a staff car waiting nearby, its driver standing at attention beside the vehicle. The entire base seemed to be operating under heightened security protocols, with additional guards visible at checkpoints and patrol vehicles moving in coordinated patterns. Captain Rodriguez remained silent as we transferred from the helicopter to the waiting car, but his expression had grown more grave during the flight. Whatever briefing materials he had been reviewing on his tablet had clearly not contained good news. As we drove through the base toward the waterfront, I found myself preparing mentally for the kind of crisis that would require immediate deployment and complex decision-making under extreme pressure. The USS Leahy came into view as we approached the pier, her imposing silhouette illuminated by floodlights that revealed the controlled chaos of a vessel preparing for emergency departure. Sailors moved with urgent purpose across her decks, while supply trucks delivered equipment and provisions that suggested an extended deployment under combat conditions. This was my world, I realized as I stepped out of the staff car and straightened my dress uniform. Not the marble halls and crystal chandeliers of my family's estate, but the steel decks and salt spray of vessels built for purpose rather than display. Here, my decisions would matter in ways that quarterly reports and profit margins never could. Here, I was exactly who I was meant to be. Admiral Rodriguez was waiting for me in the secure briefing room deep within the USS Leahy's command structure. The compartment was windowless and sterile, its walls lined with monitors displaying real-time intelligence feeds from around the globe. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced communications equipment, and I could feel the subtle vibration through the deck plates that indicated the ship's engines were already warming up for departure. "Captain Thompson," Rodriguez said, rising from his chair as I entered. His expression was grimmer than I had ever seen it, carrying the weight of someone who had just received intelligence that would reshape strategic thinking across multiple commands. "Thank you for responding so quickly. Please, sit down." I took the chair across from him, noting the array of classified folders and digital tablets arranged on the steel table between us. The security classification markings were all at the highest levels, documents that required special clearances even to be in the same room with, let alone read and understand. "Sir, what's the situation?" Rodriguez activated the room's electronic countermeasures with a gesture, ensuring that our conversation would remain secure from any potential surveillance. The soft white noise that filled the space was barely audible, but I knew it would render any recording devices useless. 3 days ago," he began, "our signals intelligence units detected unusual activity in shipping channels throughout the Eastern Pacific. Initially, it appeared to be routine commercial traffic, container ships, bulk carriers, the normal flow of international trade. But our analysts noticed patterns that didn't match typical merchant vessel behavior." He slid a tablet across the table, its screen displaying a map of the Pacific Ocean marked with dozens of colored dots representing ship positions and movement vectors. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Vessels that should have been following efficient Great Circle routes were instead taking seemingly random detours that added days to their voyages. The Chinese have been conducting what they call civilian maritime exercises, Rodriguez continued, but our intelligence indicates something far more sophisticated. They're testing our response times and surveillance capabilities, while simultaneously positioning assets for what could be either economic pressure or military action. I studied the display more carefully, my years of experience in maritime operations allowing me to read the tactical implications hidden in those seemingly innocent ship movements. "They're creating redundant supply chains," I said slowly. "Multiple routes for the same cargo, backup plans for critical shipments." "Exactly. But that's not the most concerning part." Rodriguez's finger traced several of the movement patterns on the screen. "These vessels are all registered to shell companies that, when traced through multiple layers of corporate structure, lead back to a single holding company based in the Cayman Islands." He paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. "That holding company is ultimately controlled by Pacific Maritime Ventures, which is a subsidiary of..." Thompson Development Corporation, I finished, the words feeling like lead in my mouth. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Your family's company has been providing logistical support for what appears to be a coordinated effort to test American naval response capabilities in international waters. We don't believe they're aware of the full scope of what they're facilitating, but their involvement has created a significant national security vulnerability. The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. I stared at the tablet screen, watching the innocent-looking dots that represented ships carrying out what might be preparation for economic warfare or worse. Each dot represented not just a vessel, but a thread in a web that somehow connected my estranged family to activities that could threaten everything I had sworn to protect. How long have you known? I asked. The connection to Thompson Development emerged 48 hours ago. Our analysts have been working around the clock to understand the full scope of the operation. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, his expression sympathetic but determined. Sarah, I need you to understand that this isn't about your family's politics or business practices. This is about exploitation of American commercial infrastructure for potentially hostile purposes. I forced myself to think analytically, to approach this revelation with the same tactical mindset I would bring to any complex operational challenge. What kind of exploitation are we talking about? Rodriguez activated another display, this one showing a detailed breakdown of shipping manifests and cargo documentation. The vessels involved are carrying legitimate commercial goods, but they're also equipped with sophisticated communications and sensor equipment that shouldn't be present on civilian merchant ships. We believe they're collecting intelligence on our patrol patterns, response times, and naval asset deployment throughout the Pacific Fleet's area of responsibility. The implications were staggering. If foreign intelligence services had successfully infiltrated American commercial shipping networks, they would have access to real-time information about naval movements that took years to develop through traditional espionage methods. They could track which ports were being used for military supply operations, which shipping lanes were under surveillance, which areas of the ocean were considered strategically sensitive. The Thompson connection, Rodriguez continued, appears to involve contractual arrangements for port facility management and cargo handling services. Your family's company provides logistics coordination for approximately 30% of the vessels we've identified as part of this network. I felt a cold understanding settle in my chest. My father's business empire had always prided itself on efficiency and comprehensive service offerings. Thompson Development didn't just build properties. They managed complex logistics operations that could handle everything from initial construction to long-term maintenance and operational support. If someone wanted to embed intelligence-gathering capabilities into commercial shipping operations, Thompson's infrastructure would be an ideal platform. Do they know? I asked quietly. My family, do they understand what they're facilitating? Our assessment is that they're unwitting participants. The contracts appear to be entirely legitimate commercial arrangements, negotiated through intermediary companies that concealed the ultimate beneficial ownership. But their infrastructure is being used to support activities that could compromise American naval operations throughout the Pacific theater. Rodriguez slid another folder across the table, this one containing financial documents and communication intercepts, that painted a picture of systematic deception. The Chinese operation had been masterfully designed, using layers of shell companies and legitimate business relationships to create plausible deniability for everyone involved. The problem, Rodriguez said, is that stopping this operation will require either terminating Thompson Development's contracts with these shell companies, which could expose our knowledge of the intelligence operation, or working with your family to modify their operational procedures in ways that would disrupt the intelligence gathering without revealing our awareness of it. I stared at the documents, understanding now why my presence had been required urgently enough to interrupt a family wedding. This wasn't just about national security. It was about navigating a crisis that intersected with my personal history in ways that created both unique opportunities and dangerous complications. You need someone who understands both naval intelligence operations and Thompson Development's business practices, I said. We need someone the Thompson family trusts, or at least someone they can't easily dismiss as an outsider with a hidden agenda. Rodriguez's expression was carefully neutral. We need someone who can approach them with information that will sound credible coming from a family member but might be dismissed if it came through official government channels. The irony was almost overwhelming. The family that had rejected me for choosing military service over business success now needed my military expertise to protect their business from being used against American interests. The same people who had erased me from family photos and wedding invitations were about to discover that their estranged daughter was their only hope of avoiding a national security crisis that could destroy everything they had built. "There's another complication," Rodriguez added, his tone growing even more serious. "We have intelligence suggesting that some elements within the Chinese operation are aware of the Thompson connection and may be preparing to use it for more direct purposes. If they believe they can leverage your family's business relationships for broader intelligence operations, they might escalate their activities in ways that could put civilian lives at risk." I closed the folder and looked directly at Rodriguez. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to go home, Sarah. I'm asking you to have a conversation with your family that could prevent a crisis, but will require you to reveal classified information and potentially compromise your own position within the intelligence community. I'm asking you to choose between your duty to your country and your duty to your family, knowing that the right choice might cost you both." The silence that followed was filled only by the soft hum of the ship's ventilation systems and the distant sound of crew members preparing for what would clearly be a deployment unlike any other. I thought about the wedding reception I had left behind, about the shocked faces of family members who had spent 15 years pretending I didn't exist, about the moment when they would learn that their estranged daughter held the key to protecting everything they valued. "When do we leave?" I asked. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since I had entered the briefing room. "We sail in 2 hours. But first, we need to discuss how you're going to explain to your family that their business empire is inadvertently supporting Chinese intelligence operations without starting a panic that could compromise ongoing counterintelligence efforts." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of command settle around me like familiar armor. This was why I had chosen the military over the boardroom, why I had walked away from a life of inherited privilege to pursue something more meaningful. In 2 hours, I would be sailing toward a confrontation that would test everything I had learned about leadership, family, and the sometimes impossible balance between personal loyalty and professional duty. The Thompson family was about to discover that their forgotten daughter had become exactly the person they needed, even if they had never wanted her to become that person. And I was about to learn whether 15 years of military service had prepared me for the most complex mission of my career, saving my family from themselves. The USS Leahy cut through the Pacific swells with purposeful determination, her hull slicing cleanly through waters that reflected the pre-dawn stars like scattered diamonds. I stood alone on the bridge wing, the salt spray misting my face as I wrestled with thoughts that felt heavier than the classified folders locked in my quarters below. The ship's movement beneath my feet provided a familiar rhythm that usually brought comfort, but tonight every wave seemed to carry me closer to a reckoning I wasn't sure I was prepared to face. In 6 hours, we would dock at Long Beach Naval Station. In 8 hours, I would be sitting across from my family, attempting to explain how their business empire had become entangled with foreign intelligence operations without revealing details that could compromise ongoing counterintelligence efforts. The conversation would require surgical precision, enough truth to motivate immediate action, but not so much that it endangered national security or destroyed their trust in institutions they had spent their lives respecting. But first, I had to confront the weight of my own failures, decisions I had made 3 years earlier that now seemed tragically short-sighted in the cold light of current intelligence. The memory surfaced unbidden as I watched the horizon lighten from black to deep purple. I had been serving as operations officer aboard the USS Montgomery, conducting routine surveillance of commercial shipping lanes in the South China Sea. Our mission had been straightforward: monitor vessel movements, identify patterns that might indicate smuggling or other illicit activities, and report anomalies to higher command for further investigation. It was during that deployment that I had first noticed irregularities in ships connected to Pacific maritime ventures. The vessels followed legitimate shipping routes and carried proper documentation, but something about their communication patterns had caught my attention. They used encrypted radio frequencies that seemed unnecessarily sophisticated for civilian cargo operations, and their course corrections often occurred at times and locations that coincided with known military exercise areas. At the time, I had been facing my own personal crisis. My grandmother, Margaret Thompson, had suffered a massive stroke and was hospitalized in critical condition. She was the only family member who had maintained any contact with me after my departure from civilian life, sending birthday cards and brief notes that kept me tethered to the world I had left behind. When the doctors informed us that she was unlikely to recover, I had requested emergency leave to return home for what would probably be our final goodbye. The leave request had been approved, but before departing, I had filed a routine intelligence report documenting the unusual patterns I had observed in the Pacific Maritime Ventures vessels. The report had been thorough but not urgent. I had classified it as information that warranted further investigation rather than immediate action. In my assessment, the anomalies could be explained by any number of legitimate business practices, and without more concrete evidence of wrongdoing, I hadn't wanted to trigger an investigation that might disrupt lawful commercial activities. That decision had haunted me ever since Admiral Rodriguez's briefing. If I had been more aggressive in my analysis, if I had pushed for immediate counterintelligence action instead of recommending routine follow-up, the Chinese operation might have been disrupted before it could mature into the sophisticated network that now threatened Pacific Fleet operations. But I had been distracted by personal concerns, eager to complete my shift duties and return to Los Angeles to see my grandmother before she died. The intelligence report had been filed according to proper procedures, but without the urgency that might have prompted immediate investigation. By the time I returned from leave 2 weeks later, the Pacific Maritime Ventures vessels had dispersed to different shipping lanes, and the patterns I had observed were no longer visible in our surveillance data. My grandmother had died while I was en route to the hospital, passing away just hours before I could reach her bedside. The funeral had been held at the same Episcopal church where Marcus would later be married, and I had sat alone in the back row while my family grieved together in the front pews. They had acknowledged my presence with polite nods, but made no effort to include me in their shared remembrance of the woman who had been the family's emotional anchor. During the graveside service, my father had delivered a eulogy that celebrated my grandmother's dedication to family unity and traditional values. He spoke of her disappointment in family members who had chosen paths that diverged from established expectations, and while he never mentioned me by name, the implication was clear to everyone present. Even in death, my grandmother's memory was being used to reinforce the narrative that my military service represented a betrayal of family principles. I had returned to active duty carrying the weight of both personal loss and professional regret. The intelligence report I had filed about Pacific Maritime Ventures had been processed through normal channels and archived without triggering further investigation. The Chinese operation had continued to develop and expand, using the time I had failed to recognize as critical to establish the sophisticated network that now posed a direct threat to American naval operations. Standing on the bridge wing of the USS Leahy, watching the California coastline emerge from the morning haze, I felt the full weight of that 3-year-old decision. If I had been more thorough in my analysis, more insistent in my recommendations, if I had prioritized my professional responsibilities over my personal grief, hundreds of American sailors might not now be at risk from intelligence operations that exploited my family's business relationships. The irony was almost unbearable. I had spent 15 years proving my loyalty to the Navy and my country, earning the respect of superiors and subordinates through demonstrated competence under pressure. But the one moment when personal and professional concerns had intersected, I had chosen family over duty in ways that compromised both. Admiral Rodriguez had been careful not to assign blame when he briefed me on the current crisis, but I knew that experienced intelligence officers would eventually trace the origins of the Chinese operation back to those initial surveillance reports. My failure to press for immediate investigation would be noted in files that might follow me for the rest of my career, a permanent reminder that even the most dedicated officers could make mistakes when their judgment was clouded by personal circumstances. But there was another layer to my internal struggle, one that went deeper than professional regret or personal guilt. The Chinese operation had succeeded partly because they understood something about American society that I had spent years trying to deny, that family connections could override institutional loyalties, that personal relationships could be exploited to compromise national security, that even the most patriotic individuals could be manipulated through emotional vulnerabilities. I had walked away from my family's world believing that military service represented a higher calling, that duty to country transcended obligations to blood relatives who couldn't understand or appreciate the sacrifices required for national defense. But the current crisis demonstrated that complete separation was impossible, that family ties created vulnerabilities that foreign intelligence services could identify and exploit with devastating effectiveness. The Chinese didn't need to recruit my parents or siblings as conscious agents. They had simply created business relationships that seemed legitimate and profitable, trusting that American commercial culture would do the rest. My family's pursuit of profit and prestige had made them unwitting accomplices in activities that threatened everything I had sworn to protect. As the sun cleared the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold and silver, I found myself questioning assumptions that had guided my adult life. Was my commitment to military service really about noble principles of duty and sacrifice? Or was it simply another form of family rebellion, a way of rejecting parental expectations while claiming moral superiority? Had my 15 years of naval service actually protected American interests? Or had they simply allowed me to avoid the messy complications of civilian life while feeling self-righteous about my chosen isolation? The questions had no easy answers, but they demanded honest consideration before I could sit across from my parents and attempt to guide them through a crisis that their business practices had inadvertently created. I needed to understand my own motivations clearly enough to separate personal grievances from professional responsibilities, to approach them as a naval officer seeking their cooperation, rather than as an estranged daughter settling old scores. Below me, the ship's crew moved through their morning routines with practiced efficiency, each sailor focused on specific duties that contributed to the vessel's overall mission capability. They trusted their officers to make decisions that would protect their lives and advance their shared objectives, just as I had trusted my superiors to guide me through the complexities of military life. That trust was sacred, earned through demonstrated competence, and maintained through consistent ethical behavior. In a few hours, I would be asking my family to extend similar trust to me, to accept guidance from the daughter they had written off as a failure and disappointment. The success of that conversation would depend not just on my ability to communicate complex intelligence concerns, but on my willingness to acknowledge my own failures and accept responsibility for decisions that had contributed to the current crisis. The morning watch was changing as I finally left the bridge wing and headed below to prepare for what might be the most important mission of my naval career. In my quarters, the classified folders waited on my desk like sleeping explosives, containing information that could either save my family's business empire or destroy it, depending on how skillfully I could navigate the intersection between personal loyalty and professional duty. I had 6 hours to prepare for a conversation that would test everything I had learned about leadership, responsibility, and the sometimes impossible balance between family obligations and national service. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure wasn't an option that my conscience could accept. The Thompson family was about to discover that their estranged daughter had become someone who could save them from consequences they didn't even know they faced. But first, I had to save myself from the weight of my own past mistakes and find the courage to do what I should have done 3 years earlier, put duty above everything else, even when it meant confronting the people I had spent my adult life trying to prove wrong. The Thompson family estate looked exactly as I remembered it, despite the 15 years that had passed since I last walked through its imposing front doors. The circular driveway curved beneath towering palm trees, leading to the same marble steps and classical columns that had intimidated me as a child. But today, approaching the house in my naval dress uniform, I felt different. Not intimidated, not defensive, but carrying the weight of information that could reshape everything my family thought they understood about their carefully constructed world. My father answered the door himself, which surprised me. In the past, that responsibility had always fallen to household staff, part of the elaborate choreography of wealth that kept the family insulated from mundane interactions. He looked older than I had expected, his hair completely silver now and his face carrying lines that spoke of stress rather than simple aging. When he saw me standing on his doorstep in full military regalia, his expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and something approaching apprehension. "Sarah," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected. Dad, I need to speak with you and Mom immediately. It's about the business, and it's urgent." He stepped aside to let me enter, and I found myself in the familiar marble foyer with its crystal chandelier and sweeping staircase. The portraits of Thompson family ancestors lined the walls. Generations of successful men and women who had built their fortune through careful planning and calculated risks. Soon I would have to explain how that same approach to business had inadvertently exposed them to threats they had never imagined. My mother appeared at the top of the stairs, descending with the same regal bearing she had always possessed. She wore a cream silk blouse and tailored slacks, looking every inch the successful executive despite being in her own home. Her eyes fixed on my uniform with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not disapproval, exactly, but something closer to wary curiosity. "Sarah, what's this about?" she asked when she reached the bottom of the stairs. "Your unexpected appearance at Marcus's wedding was surprising enough, but this," she gestured toward my uniform, "this suggests something more serious." "It is serious, Mom. We need to talk privately, and we need to talk now." My father led us to his study, the same room where I had announced my decision to attend the Naval Academy nearly 2 decades earlier. The mahogany desk still dominated the space, its surface now covered with financial reports and architectural plans that represented the current state of Thompson Development's empire. He closed the door behind us and activated the white noise generator that he used for sensitive business discussions, a precaution that would actually help protect the classified nature of what I was about to reveal. "I'm going to share information with you that's classified at the highest levels," I began, remaining standing while they took seats in the leather chairs that flanked the desk. "Before I begin, I need you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you must remain confidential. No discussing it with Michael or Amanda, no mentioning it to business associates, no sharing details with anyone who doesn't have appropriate security clearances." My mother's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sarah, what are you talking about? We're civilians, we don't have security clearances." Which is exactly why this conversation is both necessary and complicated. I moved to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens where I had played as a child, gathering my thoughts before delivering information that would shatter their understanding of their business relationships. Thompson Development has commercial contracts with several shipping companies that operate in the Pacific. One of those companies is Pacific Maritime Ventures. My father nodded slowly. "They're one of our largest logistics clients. Excellent contracts, very profitable. What about them?" "They're a front for Chinese intelligence operations." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner and the distant sound of traffic on Sunset Boulevard. My parents stared at me with identical expressions of disbelief, as if I had just announced that the moon was made of cheese or that gravity had stopped working. "That's impossible," my mother said finally. "We've done extensive due diligence on all our major clients. Pacific Maritime has impeccable credentials, references from established financial institutions, a track record of successful operations, all of which were carefully constructed to create exactly that impression." I turned back to face them, seeing the moment when the implications began to register in their faces. For the past 3 years, they've been using Thompson Development's logistics infrastructure to support intelligence gathering operations against American naval forces throughout the Pacific Fleet's area of responsibility. My father stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. "Sarah, do you understand what you're suggesting? You're accusing us of treason." "I'm not accusing you of anything intentional. You've been manipulated by professionals who understand how to exploit American business practices for intelligence purposes. But the effect is the same. Thompson Development's infrastructure is being used to support activities that threaten American national security." I spent the next 20 minutes walking them through a sanitized version of the intelligence briefing I had received from Admiral Rodriguez. I explained how seemingly innocent commercial shipping arrangements could be used to collect information about naval patrol patterns, how sophisticated communications equipment could be disguised as routine cargo handling systems, how legitimate business relationships could provide cover for activities that violated multiple federal statutes. Throughout my explanation, I watched my parents' expressions shift from disbelief to understanding to something approaching horror. These were intelligent people who had built their fortune by understanding complex business relationships and anticipating potential risks. As I laid out the scope of the Chinese operation, they began to comprehend how thoroughly they had been deceived. "The contracts," my mother said quietly when I finished. "The port facility management agreements, the communications infrastructure leasing, the logistics coordination services, it's all connected. Every service Thompson Development provides to Pacific Maritime Ventures is being used to support intelligence operations," I confirmed. "The question now is what we do about it." My father had been silent for several minutes, his face cycling through emotions I recognized from childhood, the concentrated focus he brought to difficult business decisions, the careful analysis of options and consequences that had made him successful. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood that his next decisions would determine the fate of everything he had built. "What are our options? Legally, you're required to report any knowledge of foreign intelligence activities to appropriate federal authorities. Practically, that would trigger an investigation that could destroy Thompson Development's reputation and expose you to criminal liability, even though your participation was unwitting. And the alternative? We work with naval intelligence to modify your operations in ways that disrupt the Chinese intelligence gathering, without revealing that we're aware of it. You gradually terminate contracts with Pacific Maritime and its subsidiary companies, citing routine business reasons. You implement new security protocols for your logistics operations that would prevent similar exploitation in the future." My mother leaned forward, her business instincts taking over despite the emotional complexity of the situation. "What would that require from us?" "Complete cooperation with naval intelligence officers who would need access to all communications, financial records, and operational plans related to Pacific Maritime Ventures. Regular briefings on any contact attempts from Chinese companies or individuals. And absolute discretion about everything we've discussed today." The room fell silent again as my parents absorbed the magnitude of what I was asking. They were successful, independent people who had built their empire through their own decisions and efforts. Now I was asking them to submit to oversight from government agencies they had never had to interact with, to accept guidance from military officers whose priorities might not align with their business interests. "There's something else," I said, knowing that full disclosure was necessary despite the personal cost. 3 years ago, I observed the initial signs of this operation during a deployment in the South China Sea. I filed an intelligence report, but I didn't push for immediate investigation. If I had been more aggressive in my analysis, this operation might have been disrupted before it could threaten American naval operations or implicate Thompson Development. My father looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, not disappointment or disapproval, but something closer to understanding. "You're telling us that you made a mistake that contributed to this situation." "Yes. And now you're trying to fix it by asking us to trust you with information that could destroy our business." "Yes." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the same gardens where I had spent countless childhood hours. When he turned back to face me, his expression had changed again, becoming something I hadn't seen since I was very young. The look of a father who was proud of his daughter's integrity, even when it cost her personally. "Your mother and I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "We've spent 15 years assuming that your choice to join the military represented a rejection of everything we valued. We never considered that you might be serving something more important than our approval." My mother nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "We were wrong, Sarah. About you. About what your service meant. About what kind of person you've become." I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying. This wasn't the vindication I had imagined during angry moments over the years, but something quieter and more meaningful. The simple acknowledgement that I had become someone worthy of respect, even from people who had never understood my choices. "What do you need from us?" my father asked, his voice carrying the same decisive tone he used when closing difficult business deals. "I need you to call Admiral Rodriguez and tell him that Thompson Development is prepared to cooperate fully with ongoing counterintelligence operations. I need you to understand that this cooperation might require sacrificing profitable contracts and accepting government oversight that could affect your operations for years to come. And in return? In return, you help protect American sailors from intelligence operations that could get them killed." You help preserve the security of naval operations that keep international shipping lanes open for legitimate commerce. You help ensure that American business infrastructure can't be exploited by foreign intelligence services. My mother stood up, smoothing her slacks with the same precise movements she had always used when transitioning from one task to another. When do we start? I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw something I had never expected to see again. I saw a family that was finally ready to work together towards something more important than profit margins or social status. I saw people who were prepared to risk everything they had built to do what was right, even when the cost might be enormous. "We start now," I said, pulling out the secure phone that would connect us directly to Admiral Rodriguez. "And Mom, Dad, thank you for listening, for understanding, and for being willing to do the right thing even when it's difficult." My father smiled, and for the first time in 15 years it felt genuine and warm. "Sarah, you're our daughter. We should have trusted you long ago." 6 months later, I stood on the deck of the USS Constellation as she entered San Diego Harbor, the morning sun painting the water in shades of copper and gold. The operation had been a complete success. Through careful coordination between naval intelligence and Thompson development, we had not only disrupted the Chinese intelligence network, but had turned it into a source of counterintelligence that provided valuable insights into foreign espionage methods. The Pacific Maritime Ventures contracts had been quietly terminated, replaced by legitimate shipping agreements that included robust security protocols designed to prevent similar exploitation. More importantly, the operation had demonstrated something that intelligence professionals had long theorized but rarely proven: that American families, when properly informed and motivated, could become powerful allies in protecting national security. The Thompson family's cooperation had been exemplary, their business expertise proving invaluable in understanding how commercial relationships could be manipulated for intelligence purposes. But the most significant change hadn't been operational or strategic. It had been personal. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Dinner Sunday at 6. Amanda's bringing the kids, and Michael wants to discuss the Newport Security Consulting Division. Your father has questions about Navy procurement procedures." I smiled, reading the message twice. 6 months ago, such casual family communication would have been unimaginable. Now it felt natural, the normal rhythm of a family that had learned to include rather than exclude, to value different perspectives rather than demanding conformity. The reconciliation hadn't been immediate or simple. Trust, once broken, required time and consistent effort to rebuild. But the crisis had provided a foundation of shared purpose that made the work possible. My parents had seen firsthand how my military expertise could protect everything they had built, while I had gained new appreciation for the complexity and responsibility of managing a business empire that employed thousands of people and contributed to communities across California. Michael and I had developed something approaching a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect rather than childhood rivalry. He had proven surprisingly adaptable when naval intelligence requested modifications to Thompson Development's operational procedures, applying his business acumen to problems of security and counterintelligence with the same creativity he brought to real estate development. Amanda had been more challenging, her prosecutor's instincts making her naturally suspicious of anything involving classified information and government oversight. But when she learned that foreign intelligence services had been exploiting American legal frameworks to facilitate espionage operations, her sense of justice had been aroused in ways that transcended family dynamics. She had volunteered to review all of Thompson Development's contracts for potential security vulnerabilities, applying her legal expertise to protect both the family business and national interests. The children, Michael's twins and Amanda's daughter, had been the most enthusiastic about their newly discovered aunt. They were fascinated by stories of naval adventures and displayed the kind of curiosity about military life that reminded me why service members fought to protect the next generation. Teaching them to sail in San Diego Bay had become a weekend tradition, a way of sharing my love for the ocean, while building relationships that had been impossible during their early years. Admiral Rodriguez had recommended me for promotion to Rear Admiral, citing not just my operational achievements but my ability to navigate the intersection between military and civilian interests. The promotion would mean new responsibilities, likely including oversight of joint military-civilian intelligence operations that had proven so effective in disrupting foreign espionage networks. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. The Naval Academy had invited me to deliver the commencement address to the graduating class, speaking to young officers who would face their own challenges in balancing duty to the country with personal relationships and family obligations. Standing before those fresh-faced midshipmen, I had shared lessons learned through years of deployments and difficult decisions. But I had also talked about the courage required to admit mistakes, to seek forgiveness, and to rebuild relationships that seemed permanently damaged. Military service, I had told them, wasn't just about protecting America from foreign threats. It was about preserving the values and relationships that made America worth protecting. The speech had been recorded and shared widely throughout the Navy, generating discussions about the importance of maintaining connections between military personnel and the civilian communities they served. Several other flag officers had requested briefings on the Thompson development operation not just for its intelligence value, but as a model for how military-civilian cooperation could strengthen both national security and family relationships. My grandmother's portrait now hung in my quarters aboard ship, a reminder of the family connections that had sustained me through difficult deployments and career challenges. But it was no longer a symbol of what I had lost by choosing military service. It represented what I had gained by learning to balance duty with love, service with family, professional achievement with personal relationships. The evening I had returned from that first family dinner in 15 years, I had written a letter to my younger self, the 19-year-old who had walked away from Pacific Palisades believing that choosing the Navy meant rejecting everything her family represented. I wanted to tell her that the choice hadn't been either, or that serving her country didn't require abandoning her family, that the strongest military officers were those who understood what they were fighting to protect. But I had also wanted to tell her that the years of separation, painful as they had been, had made her into someone capable of handling the crisis that would eventually bring them all back together. The isolation had forced her to develop independence and integrity that couldn't be inherited or purchased. The rejection had taught her to find validation through performance rather than approval, to measure success through service rather than status. The Thompson family had learned something equally important, that love didn't require agreement, that respect could coexist with disappointment, that families could grow stronger by embracing rather than rejecting members who chose unconventional paths. They had discovered that their estranged daughter had become someone they could be proud of, not despite her military service, but because of it. My father had begun wearing a small Navy pin on his lapel, a subtle indication of pride in his daughter's career that spoke volumes to those who knew the family's history. My mother had joined the Navy League, contributing her organizational skills to supporting military families throughout Southern California. These weren't grand gestures of reconciliation, but quiet demonstrations of changed perspectives and healed relationships. As the USS Constellation completed her approach to the pier, I could see my family waiting on the dock along with other relatives welcoming home their sailors. My parents stood together, their faces carrying expressions of genuine pride and affection. Michael waved enthusiastically while Amanda held her daughter's hand, pointing toward the ship and explaining something about naval operations. The children bounced with excitement, eager to hear stories about our latest deployment and adventures on the high seas. For the first time in my adult life, I was returning from deployment to a family that celebrated rather than tolerated my service, that understood rather than questioned my choices, that included rather than excluded me from their shared celebrations and concerns. The gangway was lowered, and I prepared to disembark into a life that had finally achieved the balance I had thought impossible, serving my country while belonging to my family, protecting American interests while preserving the relationships that gave that protection meaning. Captain Sarah Thompson was coming home, not to the house where she had been raised, but to the family that had learned to see her clearly and love her completely. And for the first time in 15 years, home felt like exactly where she belonged. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.